Welcome, dear students, to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. K.S. Nagaraja of Deccan College, Pune, teaching the course of Historical Linguistics. In this module, we'll study the comparative method and linguistic reconstruction. In fact, we may also modify saying comparative method for linguistic reconstruction. The previous modules have already discussed the aspects of relatedness among languages. In this module, one of the central themes of the course is developed systematically and demonstrated about its functioning and also limitations. The purpose of comparative method is finally to enable reconstruction of earlier states of related languages. The comparative method is central to historical linguistics. The most important of the various methods and techniques we use to recover linguistic history. Languages which belong to the same language family means they are genetically related to one another. This means that these related languages derive from or descend from a single original language called a proto-language. In time, dialects of the proto-language develop through linguistic changes in different regions where the language was spoken. All languages and varieties of languages are constantly changing, and then later, through further changes, the dialects become distinct languages. The aim of reconstruction by the comparative method is to recover as much as possible of the ancestor language, which may be called the proto-language, from a comparison of the related languages, the descendants of the original language, and to determine what changes have taken place in the various languages that developed from the proto-language. The work of reconstruction usually begins with phonology, with an attempt to reconstruct the sound system. This leads in turn to reconstruction of the vocabulary and grammar of the proto-language. As can be seen from the way languages are classified, we speak of linguistic relationships in terms of kinship. We talk about sister languages, daughter languages, parent language, and language families. If reconstruction is successful, it shows that the assumption that the languages are related is warranted. Comparative method could be utilized for reconstructing the lost contrast, provided that it has been retained intact by one of the two compared languages. If the latter has retained the contrast partially, its reconstruction would also be only partial. Comparative method can be viewed as comprising several steps. First of all, apparent cognates between the languages are isolated. Second, the systematic sound correspondences linking the cognate sets are uncovered. Third, a proto-segment is posited to underlie each observed correspondence. Fourth, words of the proto-language are reconstructed on the basis of the cognate sets. Fifth, the sound changes that have occurred in the development of each daughter language from the parent are stated. These changes must account for the evolution of each set of cognates from the common proto-form. Moreover, the proto-language, insofar as it can be reconstructed, must look like a real language and the postulated sound changes must be reasonable ones, changes of the kind that are known to occur. If all these steps are taken and if all the conditions are met, two things will have been accomplished. It will have been demonstrated that the putative sister languages are in fact genetically related and the parent language has been partially reconstructed. It must be clearly stressed that we reconstruct only contrasts, that is phonemes. Allophonic variations are not reconstructed. Reconstructions are marked by a rise star or asterisk mark before them. Consider the following data for my hypothetical language. Reconstruct the protoforms and indicate the changes which have taken place between the daughter languages. So here data has been provided from a hypothetical language as more of a for practice point of view, so that it is a controlled one. So when we take data from a couple of languages, here we have taken from 4 languages, and assuming that all the items have same meaning, that is same in the sense each set of correspondences have the same meaning, then once the tabulation is done, then what we have to do is to eliminate if there are any borrowed words. So the first step, find out if there are borrowed items in this list. In fact, there are 2 words which are borrowed. In fact, number 7 in the L1 and number 4 in L4 are borrowed words, therefore we should eliminate them. Next step, provide the sound correspondences. The crucial observation to be made concerning this data is not that the words for each concept are similar in the 4 languages, but rather that their similarities and differences follow fixed patterns. The sounds of the 4 daughter languages correspond in a completely regular fashion. So the sound correspondences are provided. The environments where they occur, that's also provided. So from that, we can reconstruct the proto-language that has been done. Then, once we have done that, whatever changes in the daughter languages are stated, conditions are provided. So a proto-language PL has diversified into 4 languages, L1, daughter languages, L1, L2, L3, L4. So this way, we can reconstruct the proto-language. Of course, this was a hypothetical case, therefore it was highly controlled. So let us look at another instance of or another set of data for this one. By comparing what these sister languages inherited from their ancestor, we attempt to reconstruct the linguistic traits which Proto-Romance possess. So here we are taking Romance languages. Proto-Romance is equivalent to the spoken language at the time when Latin began to diversify and split up into its descendant languages, especially the same as Vulgar Latin at the time. Of course, the word vulgar of Vulgar Latin means of the people. If we are successful, what we reconstruct for Proto-Romance by the comparative method should be similar to the Proto-Romance which was actually spoken at the time before it split up into its daughter languages. In this case, since Latin is abundantly documented, we can check to see whether what we reconstruct by the comparative method accurately approximates the spoken Latin we know about from written sources. However, the possibility of checking our reconstructions in this way is not available for most language families for whose proto-languages we have no written records. For example, for Proto-Germanic, from which English descended, or Proto-Dravidian, there are no written attestations at all, and the language is assumed only from comparative reconstruction. Let us take some data from the Romance languages given in the following table. So the data is there, the students are expected to read that. As shown in the first illustration above, though it was hypothetical, the following steps, in fact the same steps, are to be taken, or to be applicable in all comparative methods. Strictly speaking though, it is not always necessary to follow all these steps in precisely in the same sequence described here. In practice, the comparative linguist typically jumps back and forth among these steps. Again, assembles cognates. In general, it is convenient to begin with cognates from basic vocabulary, as we have already said. Step 2, establish sound correspondences. That also we have observed. Step 3, reconstruct the proto-sound, keeping the following principles in mind: directionality, majority wins, factoring in futures held in common, economy, fit into overall phonological pattern of the proto-language. Step 4, determine the status of similar or partially overlapping corresponding sets. Step 5, check the plausibility of the reconstructed sound from the perspective of the overall phonological inventory of the proto-language. Step 6, check the plausibility of the reconstructed sound from the perspective of linguistic universals and typological expectations. Another interesting example could be given here. An actual case from a language family called Nootkan. The Nootkan family has the sound correspondences seen in the table below. Nootkan correspondences involving nasals are given below here. Here we have 3 columns: Makah language, Nitinat and Nootka. The first 2 do not have nasals. The third one has only nasals. It's interesting to see that the Nootkan forms, the nasal forms, have changed to voiced stops. We'll come to that. Since no other guidelines help here, we might be tempted, based on the majority wins principle, to reconstruct voiced stops for Proto-Nootkan for these 4 correspondence sets and postulate that these changed to the nasal counterparts in Nootka. However, only a very few languages of the world lack nasal consonants. Therefore, we do not expect a nasal-less proto-language. And any postulated proto-language which lacks nasals altogether must be supported by very compelling evidence. In this case, Nitinat and Makah belong to the area of the northwest coast of North America, where languages of several different families lack nasal consonants. The lack of nasals in these languages is due to the influence of other nasal-less languages in the linguistic area. Proto-Nootkan has had nasals, as Nootka still does, but Makah and Nitinat lost nasality. Their former nasals became corresponding voiced vowel stops. The knowledge of universals and typological expectations in this case would direct us to reconstruct the proto-language with nasals and to assume a subsequent change in Makah and Nitinat. Then the step 7, reconstruct individual morphemes. Currently, existing languages which have relatives all have a history which classifies them into language families. By applying the comparative method to related languages, we can postulate what that common earlier ancestor was like. We can reconstruct that language. Thus, comparing Hindi with its relatives, Marathi, Sindhi, Bengali, Gujarati, Sinhalese, and so on, we attempt to understand what the proto-language, in this case called Proto-Indo-Aryan, was like. Thus, Hindi is in effect a much changed dialect of Proto-Indo-Aryan, having undergone successive linguistic changes to make it what it is today, a different language from Bengali and Marathi and its other sisters, which underwent different changes of their own. Therefore, every proto-language was once a real language, regardless of whether we are successful at reconstructing it or not. To understand the comparative method and to be able to apply it, we need to know some concepts and technical terms. Obviously, first and foremost, proto-language, the once spoken ancestral language from which daughter languages descend. The language reconstructed by the comparative method, which represents the ancestral language from which the compared languages descend. Then sister languages, languages which are related to one another by virtue of having descended from the same common ancestor. That is the proto-language or sisters. That is, languages which belong to the same family or sisters to one another. Cognates, most important word, a word or morpheme which is related to a word or morpheme in sister languages by reason of these forms having been inherited by these sister languages from a common word morpheme, from a common word or morpheme of the proto-language from which the sister languages descend. Cognate set, the set of words or morphemes which are related to one another across the sister languages because they are inherited and descend from a single word or morpheme of the proto-language. So the concept comparative method, a method or set of procedures which compares forms from related languages, cognates, which have descended from a common ancestral language, that is the proto-language, in order to postulate, that is to reconstruct the form in the ancestral language. The term comparative is used in a very restricted sense here. It does not refer to the comparison of any two arbitrarily selected languages, but of two or more related languages. A comparison of the former type is in fact called contrastive study. Then the notion of sound correspondence, also called correspondence set, in effect a set of cognate sounds, the sounds found in the related words of cognate sets which correspond from one related language to the next because they descend from a common ancestral sound. A sound correspondence is assumed to recur in various cognate sets. Reflects the descendants in a daughter of a sound of the proto-language is said to be a reflex of that original sound. The original sound of the proto-language is said to be reflected by the sound which descends from it in a daughter language. So basic assumption of the comparative method. There are four basic assumptions normally listed. One, the proto-language was uniform with no dialect variation. That is the assumption very clearly one has to accept that This means that what is reconstructed will not recover the once spoken proto-language in its entirety. This assumption of uniformity is a reasonable idealization. It does no more damage to the understanding of the language than, say, modern reference grammars do, which concentrate on a language's general structure. Language splits are sudden. In fact, we have already studied in the characteristic features of sound changes that the changes are regular and sudden, and also, of course, untraceable or unretrievable. After the split up of the proto-language, there is no subsequent contact among the related languages. Sound changes are regular. That's also one of the most important assumptions of comparative method. The success of any given reconstruction depends on the material at hand to work with and the ability of the comparative linguist to figure out what happened in the history of the language being compared. In cases where the daughter languages preserve clear evidence of what the parent language had, a reconstruction can be very successful, matching closely the actual spoken ancestral language from which the compared daughters descend. However, there are many cases in which all the daughter languages lose or merge formerly contrasting sounds or eliminate earlier alternations through analogy or lose morphological categories due to changes of various types. So we cannot recover things about the proto-language via the comparative method if the daughters simply do not preserve evidence of them. In cases where the evidence is severely limited to or unclear, we often make mistakes. We make the best inferences we can based on the evidence available. In general, the longer in the past the proto-language split up, the more linguistic changes will have accumulated and more difficult it becomes to reconstruct with full success. We can compare a few words here which shows merger of two different sounds. Here we take Telugu and Kannada. Kannada has maintained the distinction between the alveolar and the retroflex nasals in the medial position, whereas Telugu has lost that distinction. In fact, the retroflex alveolar have merged into one. So the data provides that one. Because Kannada retains the distinction, whereas Telugu has lost it, we can recover that lost distinction, the merger. If Kannada also had lost it, there was no way of reconstructing, retrieving it. So comparative method could help us in this instance to reconstruct the obliteration of contrast through merger in one daughter language on the basis of its retention in the other. The principle underlying the above procedure of reconstruction is sound changes are incapable of introducing new sets of contrast into a language. This is a very important principle. The whole purpose of historical and comparative linguistics is primarily to reconstruct the proto-stages of related languages. In order to do that, comparative method is employed. So this method is a very important one. Here we take data from related languages or languages which are assumed to be related based on the genetic hypothesis, and then systematically compare them and identify the variations across them, and then identify the proto sounds and then identify reconstruct the proto forms as well. So in this way, this method helps in reconstructing the proto stage of the languages concerned. It could be intermediate stage or any stage for that matter, as long as two or more languages are concerned. Their earlier stages can be reconstructed. It is necessary for historical linguistics. Otherwise, the very purpose of historical linguistics would have been defeated. So this is an important one, and the students need to study this not only carefully but also try to apply the methods on some of the data made available in books, in textbooks of historical linguistics, and also available in the internet. And even they can try to apply their own languages, taking one or two other languages available in the area so that they can understand the method correctly. Thank you.